director of the Center for Rural Entrepreneurship. We're a national nonprofit organization, and our mission is to help rural communities and regions create a more prosperous future by supporting entrepreneurs. And of course, a core part of that entrepreneurial ecosystem, if you will, is access to capital. And so I've had the opportunity through the center to do work in a number of areas related to that entrepreneurial ecosystem, but certainly the capital market has been a prime focus of a lot of the research and work that I've done. My job here today is to be brief, first of all, so that you can get to the other presenters and to set the context for the presenters that follow. So I want to talk a little bit about capital matchmaking, finding the right money at the right time. Next slide, please. So I think it's really important to start with demand. Any market has two sides to it, supply and demand, and I think that policymakers and even practitioners tend to really get caught up on the money side, the supply side of this. They focus on the money, and while that's really important, I think too often, particularly in rural places, we need to spend some time thinking about demand, understanding in our community or our region what entrepreneurial talent, which is a term we like to use at the center, the entrepreneurial talent that exists in a particular region, and where the gaps are in the pipeline. And so what you see in front of you is a pretty simple representation of the concept of an entrepreneurial pipeline that we use at the center as a way to help communities and regions really understand who's potentially out there in their community with entrepreneurial aspirations, and helps them think a little bit about where to focus. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but just want to begin with the left-hand side of the pipeline. Those folks who are really in that idea stage, if you will, for entrepreneurs, having just announced the 10 semifinalists for the Rural Entrepreneurship Challenge. A lot of the applicants for that challenge were in that idea stage. They had an idea for a business, maybe some market research out there, but really in that pre-venture kind of stage. And then both our field experience as well as research like that associated with the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor Project suggests that there's often two paths once a business starts up. A path that's driven by necessity, where an entrepreneur is starting a business for a couple of reasons. It may be the only path to creating a livelihood. You need an income. You may be in a rural place where there just is nothing else, no other opportunities for you, and so entrepreneurship is about creating a more sustainable livelihood for yourself. The other track in necessity, though, is those entrepreneurs who want to live up in the Boundary Waters area of northern Minnesota, and if that's where you want to live, you better be able to figure out how to create your own enterprise, because there's not a lot of economic activity up there. So you've got folks that are pursuing entrepreneurship out of necessity. The other path, though, and from a community perspective, the more important place to focus is those who are actually pursuing entrepreneurship are starting a business because they see an opportunity. They see a real, genuine market opportunity. They've got the skills to put together the business that can seize that opportunity, and this is where the real potential for growth lies, particularly if you're a community and you're trying to support those entrepreneurs. So from a community's perspective, we want to be over here on this right-hand side, but I think what the pipeline concept suggests is if you're not working at the front end of the pipeline, are you going to have entrepreneurs that are moving through, that are coming up with new ideas, whether they're young people or new people moving into your community, so that you can continually have new talent moving toward that growth spectrum of the pipeline. So that's just a way to think about demand, one side of the capital market. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about supply, because the real capital matchmaking occurs when you think about, well, we've got these entrepreneurs out there. How do we now begin to think about the right kind of capital for them at every particular stage of the business enterprise? And this is a graphic that was taken from some work that Eric Pages and Pat Scruggs and I did for USDA, a study on rural capital access. And so the green boxes on your screen represent a continuum from both the size of money, smaller amounts of capital from less than $50,000 on the left-hand side to over $3 million on the right, but also from an early stage venture all the way up to a venture that has been established, has grown, and is even transitioning in terms of its leadership. So you have this continuum of need, if you will, in those boxes, and then a range of sources of capital that exist in any ecosystem. And above those boxes you see vehicles for debt capital, and underneath them vehicles for equity capital. Just to point out a few things that as we move along this continuum, the traditional way that people have gotten started with in terms of capital access for business creation has been their family, their friends, their own savings, their credit cards, those kinds of resources. More recently, we've seen this burgeoning, if you will, of crowdfunding sources and people actually going out and raising money, sometimes locally, sometimes nationally, through online venues. So we're seeing more opportunities to bring some of those micro pots of money to the startup equation. And then you move through the more traditional kinds of lending, whether it's revolving loan funds that many communities have today, more traditional business loans, or community development financial institutions, which are more widespread, although they still are not as prevalent in many parts of rural America. And then larger guarantee programs, USDA guarantee programs, SBA guarantee programs for those larger deals that as businesses get into that growth phase. And on the equities side, again, the sources of capital parallel. You've got new efforts to begin to think about crowd investing. Some communities have very small seed capital funds, or nonprofit organizations might have a seed investment fund. And then you have individual angels and groups of angel investors that exist, all the way up to the more traditional sources of venture capital. So the matchmaking is between understanding your range of talent that's out there and then matching them to the right kind of capital at the right time, and making those connections. And you can see the challenge that would happen if you took someone who's on the left side of that equation trying to look for small amounts of money in a startup phase, and they're thinking about trying to connect with more traditional venture capital. You have a real mismatch there. So let me go to the final slide here and just talk about a couple of challenges that I hope set the stage for you as you listen to our presenters today. I see in the work that we've done and the experience that we've had working in communities both a challenge on the demand side and a challenge on the supply side. So let me start with the demand side again. There's an issue, and this came up in the work that we did for USDA. It's also come up in work that we've done in communities. There's an issue of capital readiness on the part of an entrepreneur. Often it's really not about the money. There may be a whole other set of things. Could be strengthening the entrepreneurial team. It could be doing more proof of concept work. It could be doing deeper market research that really is needed before an entrepreneur can effectively use capital. So sometimes you see an entrepreneur come into a service provider saying to an SBDC or someone, I'm looking for capital, when what they need to do is build some other skills so that they're ready for that capital. So that's one of the challenges that suggests that this is really about the capital market ecosystem and not just about the money. But the other issue is that when it is about the money, when someone is looking for capital, it's often difficult. If you think back to that relatively complicated set of boxes and the different kinds of capital, it's often difficult to navigate that system as an individual entrepreneur and to know where to aim. Should I go to a bank? Should I be going to the community, the revolving loan fund? So those are two of the challenges on the demand side, sort of getting an entrepreneur ready for capital and steering them to the right kind of capital. The issue on the supply side, and again I'm going to speak from a very rural perspective here, is that there are gaps in this ecosystem. There are missing parts, whether it's lack of information about crowdfunding, whether it's not having individual angels or angel groups in a particular area. Often rural areas are very well served by banks, but not the less traditional sources of capital, whether they're community development venture funds or community development financial institutions. And there's also this mismatch, if you will, between the knowledge of the traditional sectors that we have seen in rural places in the past, whether it's agriculture, textiles, or furniture manufacturing, any of those kinds of sectors, and where we see the growth in entrepreneurial activity, tech-based entrepreneurship, or software development, some of the things that a new entrepreneur, startup entrepreneur might be thinking about, going to the local bank that's used to dealing with ag lending or more traditional collateralized lending. There may be a mismatch in terms of the understanding of the sector to make those matches between the supply and the demand for capital. And so the final thought that I'll leave you with, and this comes from the place where the center has spent about 13 years of work now, there is a real role for community organizations and institutions to facilitate this matchmaking process. Yes, entrepreneurs are going to find capital if they are out there really beating the bushes and making those connections. I think an entrepreneur who's driven to create a business is going to figure out how to find the capital that they need. But community organizations, institutions, service providers can make that matchmaking happen more readily, and that's a real key to stimulating more entrepreneurial activity in rural places and to creating a more prosperous future. So Jeff, I'll stop with that. I hope that gives us some context for listening to the good examples that we have to be shared with the presenters that follow. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Deborah. That was a wonderful overview. And we will go into some more specific stories and examples and advice from some entrepreneurs as well as investors. And we'll come back for some more questions towards the end of the webinar. So next up, we have Susan Corbett. Susan is the owner and CEO of Axiom Technology. And Susan is an entrepreneur in Machias, Maine. She's been bringing broadband to her community for many years and has won many, many awards and is really passionate about these topics. And so I'm happy now to turn it over to Susan to talk about some of the creative financing ideas that she has run across.
Well, thanks so much, and it's a pleasure to present to all of you today. So I am Susan Corbett, and I'm the owner and CEO of Axiom Technologies. We are an internet service provider, an information technology company in Washington County, Maine, which is the most northeast part of the United States. In 2005, I decided to buy into this company and to tackle the job of bringing broadband to this very rural area. There are about 48 towns and territories here, and only 2 towns had broadband at that time. I was very undercapitalized, but decided to forge ahead anyway. And I started by buying 2 radios, installing them, and then with the installation money, buying 2 more. So you could imagine, as I went to the banks and tried to explain why I needed money and why that became a struggle for many years, as first we had to explain why broadband was important, and then just trying to navigate through the whole financial world. So next slide, please. So what I thought might be helpful today is in our years of looking for funding, we have been grant recipients on a federal, state, and foundation level. And one thing, there's a common thread of all of those applications, and that is to have a portfolio ready. Over the years, I've just made this an absolute must every year to update, so I have all documents in one file, so that if an opportunity for a grant comes up or I'm looking for additional capital, in very quick order I can put together and get all that information to either the grant, the grantor, or to the financial institution. A business plan, you know, is absolutely important, and I will chuckle a little bit because in my early years I wrote a business plan exactly the way I thought the banks would want it. They passed it, and then back a few years ago I wrote a real business plan that really dug into everything that we did. It took a long time. It took several months to put that business plan together, and I really thoughtfully thought out every single service we offered, what our dreams were, what our goals were, and put the budget together to match that. Today I can take that business plan and I can update it fairly quickly on an annual basis, and I do. I make that as part of that annual update. I do a pro forma, and I update that on a monthly basis. I do profit and losses statements every month and the balance sheet. I put all of those into a financial folder on my desktop. I always have my tax returns. They're scanned in and are in a folder. So, because even after you've been given a loan, it's not unusual for the banks to come back or the lenders to come back and say, okay, well, I want this year's or last year's, or I'm missing something. And so very quickly I can just forward that file along. I always keep a list of where the outstanding loans are, what the terms, the balance, the payments. Personal financial statement, same thing. We have banks that on an annual basis, they'll come back to me and say, we want to see where you stand today. And I keep that updated throughout the year. A list of an inventory, the assets. It's one of the hardest things in a company is to go through everything that you own, from products that you're selling. In our case, we have towers, we have access points, we have radios, and then inside the office we have all of our furnishings, and then there's retail that we're selling as well. So I keep lists throughout the year of where we are with inventory. Life insurance policies. Some of the lenders want to know, you know, what's going to cover the policy, the loan should you die. Articles of organization and operating agreement. If all of those are together, then you will, in a heartbeat, you can send those documents out to whoever is requesting it. Next slide, please. So it really is in the rural areas, and perhaps even in those areas that are not rural. It's all about your relationships. Who's out there? Who should you know? When I was trying to figure out how to find the funding to support the operations and the startup, I started meeting a lot of different people. I started with one of the economic development groups. That person introduced me to a couple people who then introduced me to more people, and eventually I found out who is who in the economic development world. I got to know who were the players on the state, the regional, and the local funding resources, and who are the non-traditional organizations that were lending. So there are some nonprofits here in Maine that they will fund operations that maybe a bank might not be so willing to do. So, you know, I found out who was out there, and I volunteered for a lot of boards and committees, and I also stepped into other industry sectors. For Axiom and its mission, we cross all industry sectors. So broadband is needed whether you're healthcare or education, economic development, business growth and development. It was very interesting, though, that all of these other organizations were kind of intertwined but didn't realize that they were. So it's been kind of fun to sit on those boards. Why is this important? So a little story, we were renting a historic building in downtown Machias for a few years, and our landlord was being foreclosed by the local bank. And so we decided to make a bid for the building. I had never done that before. It was a new adventure for me. I called the lenders and the economic development specialist that I knew, got their advice, told them what I was doing. So I did some due diligence and homework prior to actually attending the auction. Attended the auction, and they crazily gave me the, I won the bid. It was a great deal, but I had to close in 45 days. And there's no way that I could have got a commercial mortgage in 45 days. What I was able to do while I was at that auction is to text the economic development colleagues that I had and said, I've just won the bid, I need help. And two of the economic development organizations came together, and in 26 days we closed on that building. That gave me a time, it was a bridge loan, it gave me the time for once we closed to then work with a bank and get a traditional mortgage. So building those relationships made the path much easier, and so I would very strongly recommend that you find out who's out there and get to know them. Next slide, please. And the other thing is, I think, is just to tell your story again and again and again until everybody knows who you are and what you're doing. If you believe in in your company and in your mission, then let everybody else believe in it too. You know, that's how Jeff found me, is that he had heard about what I was doing in Maine and sought me out. So that's my recommendation, and I'll be happy to take any questions at the end of the presentation today.
Great. Thank you, Susan. So we're now going to move on and hear from a banker. And before I introduce our next speaker, I'd like to encourage our audience to type any questions you might have into the chat function or the Q&A function on the webinar. We'll be taking questions for the whole panel, and would like to hopefully have a lot of time and a lot of good questions for that. So please feel free to go ahead and start putting in your questions. With that, I'm now going to introduce Dave McCann. Dave has been a community banker and a regional banker for over 35 years. And we started with Deborah in North Carolina, and then went to Susan up in Maine, and now to David over in Ohio. David is now a business lender with Natural Capital Investment Fund. So to you, Dave McCann.
Well, thank you very much, and it's great to be with everyone. Right at the top it says CDFIs, and I think, you know, we've touched on that. It's a Certified Development Financial Institution. We get our lending authority from the Department of Treasury. So as such, we're sort of a non-traditional or atypical type of a business lender with a concentration in the Central Appalachian region of the country. Natural Capital Investment Fund is a nonprofit, wholly owned subsidiary of the Conservation Fund, which is more of a national real estate-based type company, but we're the subsidiary that does the rural development lending, you know, on the ground to younger and growing businesses. First slide, please. About NCIF, I give you a little bit of graphic and a little bit of reading. Capital Deployed Advisory Service and Assets Under Management. We started about 14 years ago, and have been primarily working in West Virginia, North Carolina, although we've expanded. 3 years ago, I came on board when they got money from Ford Foundation to expand into Appalachian, Ohio. So I live on my nephew's cattle farm here near Marietta, Ohio, down by the Ohio River, and I cover north central West Virginia, northeastern Kentucky, and Appalachian, Ohio, and beyond. We do try to work with younger companies, not necessarily pre-seed or startup companies. Sometimes we can do startups, but Generally, we're looking for people that have already started a business and have customers and have some revenue, but they need to go to the next phase or their first expansion. So, but we look at each project, as we call them, on a case-by-case basis, and sometimes that means a brand new business, and for some people that means they've been raising cattle and now they're going to raise heritage pigs or something like that, or go organic. So it can be newer businesses or a transition to another type of business, and they would need non-traditional lending where, say, your typical bank, credit union, or farm credit might not do that. But I think you can see the growth. Being a nonprofit, we don't do a lot of advertising and promoting. We work with field partners and work with economic development people a lot. A lot of our loans are done in conjunction with others, so we can make direct loans, but a lot of times we like to work with an economic development or someone like that, Port Authority, with the bank, with a savings and loan, so that way we can leverage our dollars a lot further. Because we're a nonprofit, we have to get our money from other sources. A lot of it comes from foundations, private donations, USDA, people like that. So we're a lot different than a regular commercial bank. Next slide, please. What we invest in, I like this graph because it shows you the diversity of what we're trying to do out here. Our primary markets are agriculture and the agricultural supply chain, forestry and forest industries and that entire supply chain. We're doing more in the energy efficiency and renewable energies, recycling and waste reduction. You can see, and then the food chain. We're working in these supply chains all the way through. The energy efficiency part is really kind of fun because I've been putting, or helping people finance putting solar panels on chicken houses and helping people redo their greenhouse systems so that they're using solar and using less electricity. We've done grocery stores, like local IGA stores out in the middle of nowhere, where they redo all their lighting and maybe redo some of their coolers. And some of these people are saving between 30 and 40% a year on their electric bill, which really gives a pretty good payback. And it's just good for everybody wins. I mean, they have better lighting, they have better utility bill, and we're saving on burning coal or burning oil or natural gas just to produce this electricity that we can get from renewables and using the energy efficiency. But I think you can see the diversity there. There's parts of West Virginia where we do a lot of ecotourism, where there's a lot of whitewater rafting and camping and things of that nature. We also get involved into some historical buildings, landmark type buildings, things of that nature as well. So I would say if someone has a project, the best thing to do is to contact us and talk about it and see, you know, if it would be a fit. Next slide, please. Before you approach us, here's some of the things we're going to be looking for. And I really like Susan's slide because it takes the heat off of me a little bit here of what we're asking for. The only thing I would add to which maybe under the business plan, which we always like to have, it says with market analysis. And this could fall under when she was saying her business plan. We really like to see feasibility studies and marketing strategies and what's your competition going to be. You know, give us some idea. You're creating a new jam or jelly, and why is yours won so many awards, and why is yours so much better? You know, who are you going to be selling to? How are you going to be selling to them? And how is this all going to work? And then with the competition, you know, who would be your competition, and why would you be able to overcome the market forces that would play against you? Then collateral, it's always nice to have, if you have inventory listed or receivables listed or machinery and equipment or real estate listed, that you're letting the lender know right off what you own and what you might already owe against, but also what you really have available for, say, hard collateral. Now, in some cases, it might be different. It might be a contract or a stream of revenue or things of that nature that can be assignable rather than just hard or fixed assets. And then I think the last item, along with, she mentioned life insurance, we generally like to see some kind of a succession plan or an exit, or what your exit strategy is going to be. So many times we can waive the life insurance requirement if there are other people in place that could take over should you pass away or become totally disabled. So it's good to let the lender know what your plans are for overcoming those types of obstacles, and also that, you know, I plan to build this business for the next 5 to 7 or 10 years, and then when it reaches a certain point, I'd like to sell out to a bigger company. Just those types of things in the business plan are helpful too. We like to know who's on the management team and how long you've been doing it. A lot of times I get people call and want to borrow money to put in $500,000 worth of greenhouses, and you say, well, have you ever worked in a greenhouse? Well, no. Did you work for someone else in their greenhouse? Well, no. Yeah, we're looking for people that are going to be doing things that they have experience and management experience, especially if other people are involved. So, but I think you can see, here's what we're asking, here's what we're needing. Here again, when we have private conversations, you can learn more too. So I guess I've talked a little bit about our loans. We do operating working capital type loans. We do machinery and equipment type loans. And we do real estate and real estate facility and improvement type loans. I think I might have one slide left. And there's the most important thing. If you want to get my name and my company, and I think at the end of the webinar there is some contact information too. And if you're seriously thinking about a loan, or you're needing someone that's a little bit more non-traditional in a rural type lender in that central Appalachian region, that's what we do. Now, we might not be able to approve everyone, but we'd like to try to talk to everyone and see if it's something that we can do, or try to collaborate with other business people in the community to see if we can get something done. So please feel free to contact me with your project. I'd like to talk to you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Dave, thank you so much for that. And for those of you who are wanting to get in touch with Dave or any of our panelists, we will put the contact information up on the at the end of the webinar here. But Dave, in your case, I just want to clarify, you know, for people who might view this webinar and who do not live in your service area, there are similar CDFI organizations and community lenders in regions all over the country. Is that correct? And how might people be able to find the
Yes, that's true.
Yeah. And how can people find the ones?
That's true.
And how can people find the one?
Yeah, you would go to like Google and just put it in CDFI, and then it'll take you to a spot where you can pick on it, and they'll have generally, like you could even go into your own state, say like Pennsylvania CDFI, and it'll take you to a site where you can locate those. The other thing would be is to check with, say, your state's development office. They might know of the CDFIs you can get a hold of.
That's great. And often, if the CDFI is not the place that will give you the funding, they might be able to direct you in the right organization.
Exactly. Yeah,
great.
And those people a lot of times will know who the micro lenders are too.
Excellent. Well, that's a great resource. Thank you so much, Dave. We now have our last panelist is an entrepreneur himself, and is going to share some stories about going through this process, and with more than one company. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Todd Gentry, the CEO and founder of InnoLabs. He's also founded other companies before, but he'll tell you a little bit more about those. So off to you, Todd.
Great. Well, it's good to be with you guys, and really appreciate this fantastic information so far. This is a tough act to follow. As you mentioned, I am an entrepreneur in a rural area. Winfield, Kansas is kind of in the southern half of Kansas, not too far from the Oklahoma border. Community of about 10,000 people. Fair number of industrial type manufacturing operations here in town, but for the most part, it's just a quiet, very great community to live in, and it's been very good to me in terms of both businesses that have been geared towards serving the local area, as well as businesses that have actually been more nationwide in scope. And the slide that we're looking at has actually the logos of the 3 companies I've been involved with. The first was an internet service provider business that we founded in 1995. It was a co-founder and I that created this thing, and we sold it in 1997 to a group from Wall Street that had started a roll-up operation to acquire rural ISPs, and the exit was very good and helpful. Basically, the growth trajectory was almost out of control. We went from basically nobody to about 10,000 subscribers in 2 years. We had 18 employees by the time we were acquired, and lots of large commercial accounts that were schools and businesses. But again, this was back kind of pre-cable modems, pre-DSL, so we were doing dial-up services, and we were the first and only game in town in a lot of these communities, and just growing out of control, honestly. And in 1998, the sale actually was completely consummated when the company that acquired us went public in what was actually the largest pure internet IPO in Wall Street history at the time, about $110 million IPO. Next slide, please. The next venture that I founded after the ISP was a consumer products company. And consumer products company basically designed, and I say manufactured, although we didn't actually have any manufacturing that we did in-house. We outsourced our manufacturing and warehoused in Winfield, and then sold consumer products to retailers all over the country. And some of the largest retailers that we dealt with were Walmart, Bed Bath & Beyond, Williams-Sonoma, a lot of the hardware, do-it-yourself channel, and a ton of grocery. And then we also had about 2,000 to 3,000 small independent retailers that were kind of specialty gift shops, gourmet gift shops. And one of our sweet spots was actually in cooking and grilling. Our biggest selling product was something called Firewire, a stainless steel flexible grilling skewer, and it really allowed us to open up the doors of pretty much every retailer that we hadn't kind of conquered to date. We hit about $2.5 million in sales at our peak with the Firewire product, and then actually had an exit on that in 2013. Next slide, please. From that exit in 2013, I kind of got back to my engineering roots and started a clean tech company. And it's something that I've been dreaming of for really over a decade. And basically, we've developed proprietary technology that allows us to take waste heat and use it to power air conditioning and refrigeration systems. And the primary path to commercialization for this is automotive. Essentially, we can save people about 5 cents out of every dollar they spend at the pump with our technology. That 5 cents out of every dollar is currently what the comfort tax is, that I've been calling it, that drivers pay to keep their passenger compartment cool on an annual basis. And in the U.S. alone, that amounts to about $23 billion a year that drivers spend just to air condition their cars. Another venue that we can, and we're basically using the engine's heat to power our system, so it's free energy for us, and again offers about a 5% savings across the board for drivers in the auto industry. And then in the computer industry, you can actually cool computer cases from the inside out using the heat of the CPU chipset to power our device. Hundreds of millions of dollars are spent every year to cool data centers and server farms, and we're intending to reduce that spend substantially by the data industry. And then our final path to commercialization is mobile telecom. There are equipment shelters under most of the mobile antennas that you see out in the fields, and those equipment shelters have a lot of sensitive electronics in them that have to be kept relatively cool. Our device can collect solar energy to use as the heat engine and do supplemental cooling during the heat of the day for the mobile industry. So it's a potential $150 million a year savings for them once our equipment is fully deployed. So that's kind of been my, next slide please, my history and then also my current efforts. And we've used an amazing array of funding techniques for the various businesses. And as I gain experience and learn more of what's out there, in part through networking and webinars like this, the sophistication and diversity of our funding methods continues to increase and improve. But essentially, I'll start walking you through kind of ancient history up to present day with the next slide. So with the Internet Service Provider business, again, we founded in 1995 with a $22,000 initial investment. There was a co-founder and then my grandfather who put in the initial money, and we're set up as a subchapter S corporation. Next slide. It was an interesting time both in the public markets for technology, especially internet-related stuff, and then also in the lending market. I had no idea how fortunate I was to be able to walk into a bank that we had kind of a relationship with at the time and explain our business and talk about our growth to date, and basically with just a personally guaranteed line of credit start financing the out-of-control growth that we were going through. We started with a $50,000 line, and we were very diligent about meeting all the covenants of the loan. We kept paying it back, paying it down to zero, and eventually we were able to get up to about a $350,000 line, which in no way supported the technical equipment side that we needed, but it was adequate to do the day-to-day operations until the revenue caught up with the expenses that we were adding to add people and infrastructure. Next slide. The way we really funded most of the business was through equipment leases, and these were very amazingly available as well. A lot of them were very flexible by design because the equipment that we would deploy in advance of having any customers quickly became obsolete as the technology grew and improved, also at a pretty breakneck pace. So most of our equipment leases were designed to be upgradable, so that much like your smartphone is these days. At a certain point, they said, "All right, you're eligible for an upgrade. Are you ready?" And we commit to a new lease and send the old stuff back and get new stuff, which was critical in really maintaining the level of growth that we were going through. And we had over 600,000 in equipment leases before our exit. Next slide. When we were first approached in 1997, our revenue was somewhere in the $1 million a year mark. We had a lot of, again, substantial business accounts that accounted for about a third of that revenue. And after all the due diligence, which took almost a year, and then all of the ramp up on the side of the acquiring company to get through the IPO, we came to terms. The sale price was actually determined by kind of the strike price of the stock on the day that the IPO occurred, since much of our compensation was tied to that stock. So we ended up selling the business for about $4.5 million. And we used the cash proceeds as agreed to in advance to pay off the line of credit, and the company acquired the equipment leases. So it got us out of there clean, we had a decent profit, and we ended up working for the company that acquired us for the next 2 years until they ran out of their IPO money, which occurred kind of as the dot-com era was crashing in the market, and they sold that company to Earthlink, which we then worked for about a year as the remaining founders, and they at some point said they don't need us anymore, and so that's when I was free to found a consumer products company called InnoLabs. Next slide, please. And so that was founded with basically a $50,000 personal investment, and it was set up as a limited partnership. and I was the general partner of that. Next. We took in equity investments in the way of limited partners, a total of about $1.5 million over the course of 7 years from around 2001 till about 2007. And a lot of that was to kind of fund the product development, the rollout costs, kind of give us a little bit more lending basis as we went to lenders and worked with them to fund inventory. And the company structure was set up so that my ownership percentage remained fixed. As we brought on additional partners, there was dilution only on the limited partner side, so I was always under a lot of pressure not to add too many additional equity holders. But, interesting structure for me, and as part of the equity offering, we were able to offer Kansas Angel Investor Tax Credits, which are basically a state-sponsored tax credit that returns 50% of the investor's money immediately in the way of a Kansas income tax credit. And those were very helpful in raising funds. Next. As we began moving more inventory, needing more inventory support, we went to SBA-backed loans. It was at that point that I realized how fortunate we'd been in the 90s with the lending environment at the time, because the lending environment in the early 2000s was a much different place to work. And admittedly, it was easier in the earlier days to get the SBA loans than it became in the later days. But they were always kind of our go-to for lines of credit and operating notes. We had a total of 7 during the history of the company that we took out and paid back completely. And then there was also one investor-backed loan for a total of about $350,000 that we also paid back at the end of our operation. Next, please. But one of the major tools that we used was actually having the vendor float a lot of the inventory costs for us. And we tried to arrange our terms such that they matched up as closely as possible with the payment terms from our customers, so that we were essentially using the vendor's financing to fund the operation for as much of the time as we could. And in some cases that worked great, and in some cases those two didn't align and we had to tap our bank lines of credit. But the vendor financing was actually a very important component of our growth. And one of the interesting things that began to occur in the later years was that as we developed more and more success with the FireWire product, and people would see us at trade shows, a lot of the overseas potential vendors would come by and they'd say, "You need any new products? We've got these great widgets and we'd love a presence in the U.S. We just don't know how to do it. Is that something you can do with us?" And so we would ultimately negotiate deals where they would send us inventory completely on consignment and we would pay them just as we sold it. And it was a big risk on their part, a big leap of faith, but it allowed us to kind of establish a beachhead for them without a major investment on our side. They shared in the risk. We, of course, had a lot of expenses in travel and meetings with buyers and trade show expense, so it was a pretty even risk. But consignment inventory was also another great strategy for us that really worked out great on both sides, both for the vendor and for us. Next slide, please. There was also a multiplier fund that we participated in at one point. It was through an economic development entity called Startup Kansas. And essentially it was a 10% match for money that we had borrowed or raised recently, and we had just taken out that $350,000 investor-backed loan, so we were able to qualify for a 10%, $35,000 match from the Startup Kansas group. And kind of the neat thing about that was it was very subordinate in its securitization to all the other notes, which the other banks required. So it was a great program, very low interest rate, and obviously one of those things where you just have to start your networking and ask various people, you know, what else is out there to help us fund this business, and that was the tool that we used. Next slide, please. We also received a $35,000 grant for a technology that we were hoping to develop in conjunction with an advanced manufacturing laboratory here in Kansas. Came from a group called the Kansas Technology Enterprise Corporation, and again, just one of those economic development agencies that you have to ask about and learn about because they really don't advertise, as some of our other presenters mentioned. But it was a very helpful grant, and kind of the neat thing about it was that at the end of it, we owned 100% of the intellectual property behind it. Next slide, please. Our exit in 2013 was actually the sale of the primary business assets to another consumer products company. The deal was structured as kind of a cash upfront deal with a 3-year earnout that we're still kind of right in the middle of. And then basically the debt was repaid on our side out of the sales proceeds. The debt was assumed, unlike the internet service provider business. But a very clean exit, and one that allowed me to start the next venture. Next slide. It is a sole member LLC. Next slide, please. We just completed a friends and family round of equity investments. We essentially issued $130,000 in convertible debt, and what that is basically is the investors are loaning the company an amount of money with the idea that rather than repaying it, it converts into equity, into stock at some point in the future at a price to be determined at that time, but at a discount to what those investors at that time would pay. It's kind of a neat way when a company is just starting out to avoid having to set a value on the company, so that when you're selling $130,000, you're not saying it's worth 25% of the company or 10% of the company. You deal with that in the future. And it's
So Todd, hey, this is Jeff. I'm going to just jump in and say, hey, can you kind of ramp up a little bit? We're starting to run out of time. So you've got a lot of great info and a lot of great experience, but we want to make sure we get through before our hour is up.
All right, very good, thanks. This offering was also supported by the Kansas Angel Investor Tax Credits. Next slide. And we're just now opening up a true equity offering of $900,000. It's 25% stake, and again, Kansas Angel Investment Tax Credits behind that. Next slide. One of the things we're looking at as a source of funding are strategic partnerships, where people will do design and development work for us in exchange for equity. And we're also looking at a couple pilot programs where the customer funds the initial inventory. Next. We think we'll qualify for SBIR funding, which is Small Business Innovation Research Grants. It's a potential of up to $2.5 million in non-dilutive funding. And after that, there's commitments to help commercialize the technology by the granting agencies. Next slide. And we're also talking to venture capital firms in December at the New England Venture Summit to kind of start the dialogue with those firms. And that's a much more complicated source of funding, and may require a lot of very intricate term sheets and a few other things. And it's an avenue that we're keeping open and starting the networking on, although we hope we don't have to go down it. Next slide. And finally, as we start producing inventory, we'll go back to probably SBA-backed lines of credit for the bank funding for inventory purposes. And last slide. Much like Susan said, one of the best things you can possibly do is to start your networking earlier before you actually need to interact with the source of funding that you're thinking of, especially with bankers. One of the things that I've always been told is that go find a commercial banker that you like, start a relationship before you actually intend to talk to them about funding, and just tell them what you want to do. Ask for advice. They're always happy to talk to you about business plans and ideas, and usually get some great counsel out of them before you ever commit to funding, before you ever commit to the process. And go out and do what you tell them you're going to do, and then go back to them and tell them, hey, I've done what I told you, and now let's talk about funding the next round of growth. One of the other bits of advice is to not cut corners on the legal. The due diligence process as people are looking to invest or looking to acquire your company. If there's documents that are missing or have to be created, that really causes a lot of erosion of confidence and can even kill some deals. So communicate with all stakeholders frequently. That includes banks, your economic development entities, your investors, both good and bad news. And once you're going, don't ever run out of money. It can truly be disastrous. Always have a plan to make sure you're properly funded through the next round and take the actions that you have to if you're starting to run out. Don't ever get clear to the bottom. And finally, operate with high integrity. That's the end of my presentation.
That's great, Todd. Thank you so much. There's so much good information in there. Coming from your own personal experience, that makes it that much more valuable. Really appreciate the input from all of our panelists. And now, unfortunately, I think our time is up. I think we had some questions that came in via the chat function, but I believe those have been answered by our subsequent panelists. So at this point, we're just going to move on and make sure people know about our next webinar. The final one in the series for this year is coming up on Tuesday, December 2nd, 3 o'clock Eastern Time. And that one is about finding and keeping talent, which is a topic that is of real interest to many rural entrepreneurs. And if you want to reach out directly to any of today's speakers and ask them more questions and maybe find some funding or get some more advice, here's contact information for each of them. This slide deck, as well as a rebroadcast of today's webinar, will be posted on strongruralamerica.com on the Rural Entrepreneurship Initiative website, so you can always go back and refer to this later. But with that, I'd love to thank Deborah, Susan, Dave, Todd. Thank you so much for presenting today, and thank you to all our audience out there, rural entrepreneurs. We're excited to be able to help you. Hopefully you got some great value from today's webinar. And one of the key messages that I think you heard from these folks is keep working at it. If the first time you look for money, you have some challenges, keep at it. You'll find a source somewhere, and just don't be discouraged. Thank you, everyone, and good luck.